It's not really the place for a POM to tell Australians about their wildlife, and I apologise for that. But I speak for the rest of the world, outside Australia. We know that you have, in your state boundaries, some of the greatest natural treasures in the world, fascinating and unique. If you don't look after them, nobody else will, and if they go, nothing can replace them.
On behalf of the endangered species of New South Wales, I'm calling on the New South Wales Government to protect additional areas of forest and woodland, including Chalundi, in national parks to avoid the extinction of the masked owl, yellow-bellied glider, spotted-tailed quoll, koala and other endangered species.
Tell them that the forests are our homes.
Those species are Australians just like we are. They are losing their homes. We humans shouldn't take everything for ourselves. We should have enough for other species to ensure that they don't become extinct.
The trees make the air we breathe. It's as simple as that.
Protecting the ancient forests is for the benefit of humans as well as for the species who live in them. The forests are the lungs of our planet. They maintain the stability of climate.
And what about the water? Ask them, where do you think the bloody water comes from?
They protect water catchments, ensure clean drinking water, as well as protection from floods and droughts. And they contain the gene pool that holds the foods and medicines and industrial products of the future.
Tell them we're all strands in the same web of life. If you allow us to disappear, the web becomes frayed and tattered and eventually collapses. Humans will die of a great loneliness of spirit.
We are all strands of the same web of life. If humans allow these creatures to disappear, the web becomes frayed and tattered. I put it to the House that without these wonderful creatures, humans will die of a great loneliness of spirit. It is the job of this Parliament to protect these critical habitats and species. We know what must be done. All that is missing is the political will. Extinction. It is the choice of this House. Thank you, Madam President.
You have a choice. The way this story ends is still unknown. It could be devastation and extinction you pass on to your children and your children's children. Or it could be that you can wake up in the morning and smile at yourself, having hit the brakes in time to save great wild spaces of how the world used to be. Spaces where I and my friends can live out our lives and continue to evolve alongside you into the bright future. Extinction. You choose.
I've made a number of films over the years, all of them campaigning films, and this was the most recent of them, although it's nearly 10 years old now. In 2002, we'd been struggling for nearly 25 years for the rainforests of New South Wales, starting in 1979 at Terania Creek, and basically non-stop forest actions had been going on. And there was a state, New South Wales state election coming up in 2003, and we realised that the remaining high conservation value old growth forest in the northeast of New South Wales, anything that couldn't be saved by this election would be gone 4 years later by the time the next election came along. Basically, so much forest had been saved and so much forest had been destroyed that according to the North-East Forest Alliance, there was only about 70,000 hectares of high conservation value forest in public hands that was still worth struggling for, that everything else had either been trashed or had already been protected. A huge amount of New South Wales forest had been protected by then, but there were many patches that we still wanted to save. But we were also realising that after 25 years, the New South Wales public was just getting sick of hearing about trees. Every time we did another talk about trees, we couldn't help but notice people's eyes glazing over, and it's just like, oh, not again, you know. So we decided that we were going to do a campaign based upon 4 endangered species that live in these very forests. So in order to protect these species, the only way to protect these species was by stopping their habitat from being destroyed, that is, by protecting the trees. But this was a way of campaigning that didn't require us to do what we'd been doing over and over again for 25 years. So these 4 species were koala, spotted-tailed quoll, yellow-bellied glider, and masked owl.
Koalas live in forests and woodland and spend most of their days sleeping in the trees. They only become active at night when they go to forage. Of the 4 quoll species originally found in New South Wales, the tiger quoll is the only one remaining. Masked owls are amongst the largest and the most powerful owls in Australia. The yellow-bellied glider is very sensitive to forest disturbance, often vacating an area when logging first begins.
So our first stroke of good fortune was finding a retired costume maker. He'd worked for Disney in Hollywood all of his life, making costumes, and he'd retired to the Gold Coast, and he was ready to make us costumes of these 4 creatures. And then he enlisted the design, the fashion design, and I think it's like the millinery students at TAFE in Lismore to help him build the costumes. And so their teacher made these costumes the class project for 1 term. And you know, as you'll see, we were able to make the most magnificent costumes. And so then we were able to get the help of the best wildlife cinematographers in Australia who had already filmed these creatures in the wild, so that we could kind of morph from the costume to the actual creature. And finally, we got all these celebrities to help us. So David Attenborough agreed to present and narrate it, as did David Suzuki and David Bellamy, sort of the 3 wise Davids, we thought of them. And Olivia Newton-John was the voice for koala, Jack Thompson was the voice for quoll. So we had lots of celebrities. With David Attenborough, we found a film camera person in London who agreed to travel to David Attenborough's house, and we had a list of questions for David Attenborough, a list of things for him to read to the camera, which, as you'll see, he did. But then the last thing we said was, and do you have anything that you would like to say in your own words to the people of New South Wales? And he really let us have it. It was really good what he did. So it was brilliant. So then we finished the film about 3 months before the date of the election, and then we had teams of people set up so that we had at least 1 show a day, and some days we had 2 shows. We did more than 100 shows in cities and towns around New South Wales showing the film. The film meant we didn't have to talk about the issues because the issues are all described in the film, but when the lights went on at the end of the film, there'd be 4 card tables at the back of the hall and letters to the government asking for these forests to be protected as habitat for these species. I didn't mention we'd usually get to the town in the morning from wherever the gig was the night before, and the 4 costumes would parade through the street handing out leaflets for the show that night, you know. And so we went to 100 different places. I don't know how many thousand letters poured into the government. They knew what we were doing, and so they knew that these letters didn't necessarily represent everybody in New South Wales or anything, but politicians get really nervous in the run-up to elections, which is why we'd done this campaign. And sure enough, 2 weeks before the date of the election, the then Premier Bob Carr announced that if elected, he would protect the forests in question, the remaining high conservation old-growth forests of northern New South Wales. And 6 weeks after he was re-elected, he did so, and 70,000 hectares was protected in a dozen new national parks and extensions to national parks. And shortly after that, the North-East Forest Alliance actually disbanded. One of I would have loved to bring David Attenborough and David Suzuki and Olivia Newton-John along tonight, but they couldn't make it. But the only star of the film that could make it is Ian Cohen, who was a Greens senator in New South Wales. Not senator, what do they call them? Upper House member in New South Wales at the time, and as you'll see, he represented us in the Parliament. And so I've asked Ian if he will talk a little bit about current New South Wales forest issues. So this film will show you both, you know, like a successful campaign, and also it's a kind of a very franchisable way of doing things, that any time there's an election happening, there will be endangered species. Like, you could do this anywhere in the world and get the same result. I'm sure of that, you know. So I think that apart from the historical interest, I think that it's a kind of an important template for a campaign. On with the show.
Australia has an abysmal record of species extinction. More mammals have become extinct in Australia over the last 200 years than in any other country in the world. The Threatened Species Conservation Act lists 80 animals and 300 plant species in danger of extinction in New South Wales.
Well, thanks, and thanks, John. I first met John in 1980 as a bright, bushy-tailed young greenie, and down at the a beach protest on the mid-north coast. And John's been going hard ever since. We sort of bumped into each other at the Daintree, all the major, you know, Daintree, Franklin River, all the major rainforest issues of the late 70s and early 80s. And John then went off and did the Rainforest Information Centre, and he started a whole sort of movement, if you like, which we followed in the north of New South Wales, sort of almost with a religious fervour of saving the rainforest. And one of the things that was interesting about that, because in those early days, that was in the 80s, the Rand government, and we won huge swathes of rainforests. But what we didn't appreciate, and what this then came as a later evolution of our campaigning, which was the old growth forest. We were so focused on rainforests, we weren't looking at the values of a lot of the other forest types. And the species-rich forests are often the drier forests. So all those animals featured there found primarily in other areas that didn't gain protection in early times. It was a later period that we were campaigning on the old growth forests, and you may have heard of a beautiful forest on the north coast called Chalundi, which gathered many activists, mostly young, some of us not so young, together to do the most brilliant display of strategy, theatre, and in many cases real bravery, just withstanding the might of the New South Wales Police Force and the logging industry, and actually stopped a lot of logging in the old growth forest. So we had a later period with the old growth forests, and we were very successful. And this film was an integral part. And I guess if I want to impart anything that's of relevance here, it is theatre, entertainment, imagination, that we've got to capture the minds of people. I know myself, and I'm sure John would see the same working in these areas for over 30 years, that it's really difficult to just keep telling people this is what should happen. And as John said before, people glaze over after years of it. But this film achieved something, that theatre of the environment, that creativity that really gets the point across, especially the young kids. And they go home and they tell their parents, why aren't you voting for the Greenies? That type of thing. So it's been, in many ways, a slow evolution, too slow for many of us, but that's the nature of things. But there have been waves of quite dynamic success. And what we've seen then after 95, we campaigned for Chalundi, one of those magnificent old growth forests, very rich in species diversity, animal species diversity. And we had the Carr government came in, and Bob Carr, who was the Environment and Planning Minister under the Rand government, he was committed. I mean, it's hard to get politicians to be committed. They always look over their shoulder to see how they're going to go at the next election. But nevertheless, he was a significant premier in the history of New South Wales after Carr that saved quite incredibly large tracts of invaluable old growth forests. And we're talking, you know, rainforest and old growth forests, about 3%. That's all we're arguing over of what was originally here in New South Wales. Tiny, tiny pockets that are left. And so we had quite a significant series of victories. And for me, it was one of the main reasons why I went into Parliament. In the Green movement, there's many different aspects of looking at the focus that one can undertake. But for me, it was to achieve as much saving of the forests and other ecosystems as I possibly could in the 16 years that I was in there. It's interesting to see, we have, for example, and it was mentioned on this film, in 1995, there was threatened species legislation. I was very much part of that. I was very proud of that. And it was a fantastic thing that we got through with the election of the Carr Labor government. But what we've seen in recent years, to the point where now I'm sort of fighting many issues up in my home area in the far north coast, threatened species legislation has been so dissected by the planning boffins and developers and those who try to get around it and legal actions. Threatened species legislation gets used by developers where they say, well, yeah, this road through here isn't going to actually cause animals in that overall area to become extinct. So they're able, by bits and pieces, death by 1,000 cuts, to develop in areas where they shouldn't. So I guess I'm just saying, it's, you know, price of democracy, eternal vigilance, price of conservation is, you know, keep giving them a hard time. Because if you let go, you find that the legislation that's been put in place gets subverted by, you know, that great incentive, greed and money. And we find that those pieces of legislation don't have the same effect some 20 years later, very unfortunately. But nevertheless, we've seen sort of ebb and flow of conservation successes over the time. And just mentioning now what is happening, I guess, in a lot of ways, yes, we've saved significant iconic areas. Some of them are under threat again in a different way. You've probably heard of the coal seam gas issue, which has taken a lot, even conservationists at a certain time, a bit on the back foot, because we all at certain times felt that gas was a good transitional fuel source away from coal and oil, and to allow solar, wind, etc. to get going. But what many of us didn't realise, I certainly didn't realise 10 years ago, that the coal seam gas is not just getting gas from a major gas fields like Moonee or North-West Shelf. That's bad enough in itself, but it's actually in everybody's area, in all sorts of environments, going in small scale relatively, but undertaking huge damage whilst they're exploring and then eventually you know, fracking and extracting the coal seam gas. So that's a major problem. Associated pipelines they're talking about in Queensland and in northern New South Wales, going through significant World Heritage areas in my area of the state, up near the Caldera and the far north of New South Wales. So the pressures are on, they're ongoing, so it doesn't stop at all. And you know, we're dealing with a dwindling resource of conservation at any particular time in history, and it's quite tragic. Those forests, the Pilliga in particular, which I was part of gaining significant areas in conservation. It was the last big one of a forest type that we're able to get protected, but then coal seam gas is starting to be exploited in a big way in the Pilliga itself. So you take one step forward, half a step back, but you keep at it. But it's certainly important to recognise that all these different impacts on our forests are ongoing. The issue doesn't go away. We can't just stop and say we achieved a certain amount. I guess it's a matter of the next generation to be able to continue on the work, a lot of the good work that people like John have done over the many years to continue to, I guess, give the bastards as hard a time as possible because they deserve it. There's no argument, and the only thing they listen to, unfortunately, is a potential loss of job. And so we can act politically and on the ground and through direct action. There's no argument as what's good or bad or better than the other. It's whatever turns you on personally. And remember, if you can get people even to go away from this particular meeting, if everyone writes to the Premier about coal seam gas, for example, and its impact, that has quite a significant effect. So don't ever come to a meeting and don't do anything about it afterwards. Everyone together can have a significant effect on affecting the politicians. Interestingly, we're getting more response from a coalition Conservative government in New South Wales than we did under Labor at the end of their debauched 16 years. They really went down and they deserved to lose. I'm not going to argue against that one. But in Queensland, the Labor government is allowing some major developments. But in New South Wales, the Conservative government that is not, you know, renowned for its environmental sensitivity is actually getting huge pressure from the farming lobby, their own people, people who work the land, people from the Liverpool Plains, which is the breadbasket of New South Wales and export agriculture, and resource in terms of the land, the black soil plains of the Liverpool Plains is second to none in the world in terms of agricultural production. So we're seeing this clash between miner and farmer, and it's wedging this Conservative, otherwise, you know, environmentally uninterested coalition government. It's going to be very interesting to see what will happen in the near future. So there's always a light at the end of the tunnel. We just have to keep pushing toward it and putting pressure on the government of the day, not quite knowing what the end result will be, but, you know, you've got to do something about it, as the animals tell us. Thanks very much.
One thing I'd like to add is that I went to a meeting talking about coal seam gas in Sydney because maybe you've heard that there's been permission given for coal seam gas exploration for a mine to be drilled in St Peters, which is only 5 or 6 k from Central Railway Station. So I find this particularly significant from a movement building perspective. The real problem is in the Pilliga scrub, you know, where some of the best forest in New South Wales is going to get totally trashed by a huge number of wells. But there's no one, you know, it's very few people who will be opposing that. Whereas if people in St Peters get hot under the collar, as they are doing, it's going to be really significant. And one of the things that I learned at the Coal Seam Gas Information Night was that although they've only been given permission to do one well, because it's got to be so far from the nearest dwelling and so on, and they've only found a site for one well, once they dig that well, they can go for 7 kilometres horizontally in every direction, drilling horizontal wells and doing fracking under the ground. And that's where the fugitive emissions, as they're called, because the cracks that happen when they do the explosions in the coal seams to release the gas, the cracks move upwards because that's where there's the least pressure, of course. And so the methane starts to come up all over Sydney. And so there's a real opportunity, I think, to build a movement in Sydney amongst people who have perhaps never had anything that threatens to impact them personally and the value of their property before. So I'm just wondering whether perhaps Transition Bondi might want to invite the woman who gave this presentation, Jacinta Green. She's a scientist and gave the most brilliant presentation about coal seam gas. Maybe you'd consider inviting her over here for one of these nights, because it was a real eye-opener for me, and it's actually changed my plans. That's going to be what I do next year, is help her with building a movement in Sydney about coal seam gas. My interest, as I say, is much more with the Pilliga scrub, but I reckon it's only if we can build a movement in Sydney that we've got a chance in the Pilliga scrub. So thanks so much, Ian, and thanks for everyone for showing up.